Good afternoon on today's Angry Bulletin. UFO skeptics commonly observe that the vast majority of UFO sightings take place in the United States or in locations where there's a considerable amount of American military activity and not in other nations, indicating that UFOs only crop up in areas where UFOs exist in popular culture to a much greater degree. However, these statistics exclude one of the most active UFO hotspots on the planet, and that is in Russia or the former Soviet Union. UFO cases have been rampant in this nation for many decades, supported by media reports and by the Russian military. And the Russian fascination with UFOs has absolutely nothing to do with their American counterparts. It is a completely independent tale, and a fascinating one at that. All of this and more coming at you on the Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon, and once again, welcome to another Angry Alien Bulletin. I have been putting this topic off entirely too long, and even though, I've been releasing a lot of alien content lately, I wanted to get this one out before I got buried in more urgent, pressing spaceflight news. So for those of you who don't really like UFO, UAP stuff, bear with me because we're going to be getting back to the usual content on this channel soon. But for those of you who do like UFO and UAP content, which includes me, absolutely, well, I've got a very interesting topic for you today, and that is the other hotspot on Earth for UFO sightings, a place where there have been a vast number of mass sightings with a great deal of credibility, including things that took place almost half a century ago. This is, of course, what we today call Russia, but what was once the Soviet Union, a nation that encompassed a much larger area of territory, areas that are now, of course, independent countries such as Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Belarus, etc. But this, of course, all used to be part of one giant nation that encompassed, and actually still encompasses, 11 time zones. So one would think with such a vast expanse of territory, you would have at least some UFO sightings. And yes, this is indeed the case. Not just some UFO sightings, but quite a number of UFO sightings. And not just anecdotal sightings, but rather sightings supported by the Soviet military, Russian military, and some very prominent members of the Russian government, Russian media sources, etc. Very compelling and interesting cases, some of which were actually very distinctive, very different than some of the reported cases in the United States or just the Western world in general. And also, it's very interesting to note that in Russia, and indeed even in the Soviet Union, if you talked about UFOs and aliens, UAPs, whatever, you were not subjected to the same level of criticism, the same level of professional disdain from the scientific community, from the government, the media, etc. It just isn't quite as big of a taboo subject in Russia as it is over here. And let me tell you something. These cases are every bit as intriguing and every bit as compelling as the most recent cases that have been reported in the United States. And most importantly, they come complete with quite a lot of footage that I at least have never seen before. Now, I want to make one thing completely clear. I have no idea if this footage is genuine or if any of it is CGI manufactured or just, I don't have a great deal of professional expertise when it comes to this type of footage, and I'm not going to be providing any of my own commentary as to whether or not I think it's fake or if I think it's genuine and why. I'm not the kind of person who just watches this stuff and says, yeah, that looks legit to me. I'm not a special effects expert. I'm not a photographic analyst or anything like that. I don't have any history in analyzing military photos, for example, with the Air Force. Without that kind of background, I don't see how I'm qualified at all to make any sort of determinations on these sorts of things. All I can do is show you the footage, you come to your own conclusions, and also share these cases, which once again are very compelling. Perhaps the most widely observed mass sighting of UFOs in human history was the so-called Petrozavodsk UFO, which was a series of events that took place on September 20th of 1977. These sightings were reported all the way from Copenhagen and Helsinki in the west to Vladivostok in the east, thousands and thousands of kilometers with similar reports. The event was named after the city of Petrozavodsk, where the vast majority of the sightings took place, or at least the most spectacular sightings, were a glowing object that looked something like this. This is supposedly the only remaining photograph of the object that was reported. It showered the city with a wide variety of rays, which left physical evidence of their existence, qualifying this case as a close encounter of the second kind, in the old way of classifying these things, where a UFO leaves some sort of physical evidence that it was there in the first place, but not a close encounter of the third kind, where you encounter alien life forms in addition to the UFO itself. So between 1 a.m. and 1:20 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, about 48 unidentified objects reportedly appeared in the atmosphere, and sightings began to take place in a wide variety of locations, either near or in the Baltic republics of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And also in Helsinki, Finland, sightings of a glowing ball were reported by newspapers on September 20th and also on the next day. The ball was observed by many residents in Helsinki, including taxi drivers, the police, and also Helsinki airport personnel. An unidentified object was also observed near the town of Turku, where a pair of witnesses claimed that they spotted an object at a distance of about 300 meters, and it was spinning similar to a life buoy, and it was approximately 10 meters in diameter. Now, Tuorla Observatory, or rather an astronomer there named Pekka Tirkorpi, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, claimed that this entire phenomenon was caused by the launch of a Soviet satellite known as Cosmos 955, and the aftermath of that launch caused this strange jellyfish-like effect, very similar to the types of effects that we see in the aftermath of Falcon 9 launches. Now keep in mind, Falcon 9s were not going off a couple times a week in 1977 in Russia, so something like this would have been very unusual and would have attracted a hell of a lot of attention in those days. Well, Falcon 9 launches attract a tremendous amount of attention today, so that does make some degree of sense. However, as you're going to see a little bit later on, it doesn't explain everything. This was far more widespread of an incident than a launch like this could possibly account for. Now, a pilot also reported seeing something like this over Copenhagen, a Finnish airline aircraft flying from Rome, and also glowing objects were observed in various places in the Soviet Union, mostly in the northwest, once again corresponding maybe to a launch of a Soviet satellite, but there were some big inconsistencies. For example, in the settlement of Krukjoki, which is also in this region, an engineer named A. Novozhilov compared this object to an airship. He reported the sighting to the candidate of technical sciences, Konstantin Polovitsky, who recorded the incident. He saw what he thought was a meteor at first, but after some time the object had stopped and then started moving towards him, quickly increasing in size and acquiring the well-outlined shape of an airship, a cigar-shaped craft. And by the way, you're going to see a pattern to this with other Russian UFO reports. The object was faceted and tipped with brightly shining spots on the front and back. The edges were glowing with white light, which was slightly fainter than the spots. The facets resembled windows lit from the inside and were evenly glowing with white light that was fainter than that of the edges. The object reportedly moved at an altitude of about 300 to 500 meters, being 100 meters long and 12 to 15 meters in diameter. Still approaching Novozhilov, the object moving from west to east had released a brightly shining ball from the rear which flew north. The ball was flying horizontally and then descended behind a forest. The landing reportedly caused the appearance of a bright glow. At 4:15 a.m., and by the way, by this time, any evidence of a rocket launch should have been long gone, Novozhilov tried to take 3 photos of the sighting with a 0.1 second exposure, but he couldn't manage to do it with the camera he had at his disposal. But he did say that the object was much larger than the moon and moved with the speed of a helicopter, at least from his perspective. The total time of the sighting was between 10 and 15 minutes. And there was another account given by the Soviet writer and philosopher Yuri Limnik. He described an object near his dacha in the settlement of Namoyevo, which is significantly east of the rest of these sightings, and he looked at it through an amateur telescope with an 80 times magnification. The lens-like object, surrounded by a dim translucent ring, had the color of a dark amethyst, intensively lightened from the inside. The edges of the lens-like object had 16 spots, or he actually called them nozzles, which emitted pulsating red rays at an angle of 10 to 15 degrees. The angular size of the object from his perspective were about 20 arc minutes. And once again, this is from an amateur astronomer, so pretty credible witness in my opinion, but all of these sightings pale in comparison to what happened at Petrozavodsk. This is a major industrial hub of what used to be the Karelian Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, with a population of over 200,000 people way back in 1974. The first account of this sighting was written by TASS correspondent Nikolai Milov. Now keep in mind, the Soviet news agencies were very strictly controlled by the government in those days, so you just didn't write whatever fanciful account you wanted to. It had to have something backing it up, or there had to be a very compelling governmental reason to make these types of reports. But what he described this object as being as a huge star that flared up in the dark sky at approximately 4 a.m. local time, impulsively sending shafts of light to the Earth. And again, his report was published in the mainstream Soviet press. So we're talking newspapers like Pravda, Salaskaya Zhin, that sort of thing. And a local newspaper, Leninskaya Pravda, also reported this object. Now, the preliminary analysis by the Academy of Sciences at the USSR in 1977 found the eyewitness reports to be mutually consistent and complementary, so credible, according to the Academy of Sciences. According to the report, the star was spreading out over Petrozavodsk in the form of a jellyfish, showering the city with a multitude of very fine rays, which created an image of pouring rain. The news report also said that after some time, the luminescent rays ceased, and the jellyfish turned into a bright semicircle, which then moved away towards the east. Indeed, the vast majority of these reports all talk about a west to east movement, which was very inconsistent with the launch of a Cosmos spy satellite. And this is what the Soviet investigation also concluded. All rocket launches from the Soviet Union, at least from that region of the country, went from east to west. Obviously, you want to do that to launch it out over the Baltic, where if there's any sorts of problems or malfunctions, the rocket will fall down into the ocean, as opposed to launching it from west to east, where it will come crashing down over inhabited areas. So this is an inconsistency in the whole Cosmos satellite explanation. One of the most compelling and interesting cases from Soviet UFO history, but it gets even more interesting when, in the process of reviewing some declassified classified CIA files on UFOs, I came across a Soviet encounter in July of 1988 that included a report on an amazing event that took place on Hill 611 near the village of Dalnegorsk in the Primorsky Krai. The article noted that the event is still under investigation. Many observers saw a flying sphere crash into one of the hill's twin peaks, and physicists and other scientists from the Siberian division of the USSR Academy of Sciences are still studying the fine mesh, small spherical objects, and pieces of glass that are considered to be small remnants left behind by the sphere. And once again, keep in mind that the vast majority of UFOs being reported by the Pentagon these days are spherical. According to the article, the alleged spacecraft was nearly obliterated in the crash, but there appears to have been enough material at the site for the scientists, who are a mixture of UFO enthusiasts and skeptics, to eventually, quote, penetrate this mystery, unquote. In studying the site, scientist A. Makayev reported finding gold, silver, nickel, alpha titanium, molybdenum, and compounds of beryllium. Now, there's something I'd like you to note here. In the spherules found by Avi Loeb's team, the Galileo project off the coast of New Guinea, high concentrations of beryllium were detected in those spherules as well, along with uranium. Why is this significant? Well, as I reported in a recent exclusive video on my Patreon channel, beryllium is a substance that reflects neutrons. Why is that useful? Well, the more neutrons that you have zooming through fissile material like uranium-235, the more energetic a nuclear reaction is going to become. In other words, beryllium cylinders or beryllium spheres.
You broke the bloody ship!
Computer, is there a replacement beryllium sphere on board?
Computer, is there a replacement beryllium sphere on board?
Are used to control the heat and power levels of nuclear reactors. You have beryllium on one side of the cylinders and boron on the other side of the cylinders, which absorb neutrons, and depending on which way you rotate the cylinders towards the nuclear reaction, you have direct control over how energetic the nuclear reaction and the heat of the reactor actually is. So yeah, beryllium is a thing, and beryllium and uranium are actually two key components in a reactor that could be used to power a spacecraft.
You know, that is really getting annoying.
Look, I have one job on this lousy ship. It's stupid, but I'm gonna do it, okay?
Some of the scientists have concluded that the object that crashed into Hill 611 was an extraterrestrial space vehicle constructed by highly intelligent beings. Doctor of Chemical Sciences V. Witowski stated that without doubt, this is evidence of a high technology, and it is not anything of natural or terrestrial origin. He cited the fact that the remnants of fine mesh included bits of thin threads with a diameter of only 17 microns, and that these threads in turn were composed of an even thinner strands twisted into braids. Extremely thin gold wires were discovered intertwined with the finest threads, evidence of an intricate technology beyond the present capabilities of terrestrial science, according to Witowski. Once again, maybe it's not beyond our present technology, but back in 1988, this apparently was a very big deal. And by September 30th, 1989, the CIA noted that the media all over the Soviet Union was receiving reports of UFO sightings on the ground and in the air, adding that the paper's editorial office was reviewing hundreds of reports related to UFO incidents. In response to this deluge of reports, the paper interviewed Anatoly Lisatrov, chairman of the section of the All-Union Astronomical and Geodesic Society assigned to study the anomalous phenomena, who said that although his group is still wandering around in the darkness, as he put it, some important developments in the investigations had recently occurred. He stated that at the sites of the landings, the operating frequency of crystal-controlled oscillator changes. In other words, electronic timepieces were running at rates that either were too fast or too slow. He also noted that Soviet military officers and pilots had started providing some documentation on UFO sightings. For an example, he stated that he had documentary information regarding an encounter between Soviet aircraft and a UFO over the city of Borisov. The crews of 2 Soviet aircraft reported seeing a large flying disc in their vicinity with 5 beams of light emanating from it. 3 beams were directed towards the ground and 2 were projected upward when the object was first sighted. The ground controller instructed one of the planes to alter its course and approach the object, at which point the disc flew to the same level and aimed one of its beams at the approaching Soviet plane, illuminating the cockpit. Lysatrov cited the pilot's log as stating, "At this time, the co-pilot was at the controls. He observed the maneuver that the object had just carried out when was able to raise his hand to shield himself from the unbearable light. The aircraft commander was resting on the adjoining seat and a bright ray of light projecting a spot with a diameter of 20 centimeters passed across his body. Both pilots felt heat." Now, according to Lysatrov, the aircraft commander and his co-pilot both became invalids shortly after the incident. The co-pilot was forced to leave his job due to a sudden deterioration in his health, including the onset of sudden prolonged periods of loss of consciousness. The aircraft commander died within a few months. The cause of death was listed as cancer, and injury to the organism as a result of radiation from an unidentified flying object was listed as a contributing factor on the official medical record in the hospital where the commander died, or at least according to Lysatrov. And then finally, there was Marina Popovich, died just a few years ago, sadly, the first woman to break the sound barrier in a MiG-21, and she claimed that there were over 3,000 documented cases of UFOs and Soviet military pilots, most of which are still classified to this day, and she was advocating for the veil to finally be lifted over all of these incidents. And by the way, she also claims that during her time training as a cosmonaut, she learned of an encounter close to the Martian moon of Phobos with a Russian probe that survived just long enough to set down on the surface, which also photographed a cylindrical object in the Martian sky that could have been several kilometers in length. If you'd like to see a video about her and her experiences and claims, well, make sure to leave a comment. In the meantime, I have run out of time with this amazing and fascinating topic, but I have just scratched the surface with Soviet and Russian UFO cases. So once again, if you want to see more, please leave a comment. I would also like to thank new Patreon members Steve Thompson, Marius Nabal, and Kevin Heath. And I'd also like to thank Barry McMillan for increasing his Patreon pledge. Thank you so much for your support, and because of your assistance, we have hit our next milestone, and I will be releasing my 3rd Patreon exclusive video, this one about a new type of bleeding edge propulsion that could revolutionize space flight, but I will be releasing that on my Patreon channel this week, along with my first ever Patreon live stream. So if you'd like to see that and new content on that particular channel, well, all the details are in the description. Please like, please subscribe, and as always, stay angry about space.